Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bridget McNulty. I'm here from Sweet Life Diabetes Community and so delighted to be here with you today. We are going to be talking about all things food and sensor technology and how on earth we are supposed to manage diet and diabetes. And I know you have a lot of questions because I already have a long list of questions from the people who've RSVP'd to our event. But if you have any live questions, you're also welcome to pop them in the comments and I will ask our guest. I'm very pleased to introduce our dietitian, our expert for the day, Fran Stiert. She is going to be joining me on stage in just a minute, and Fran's going to be sharing her wisdom and advice about food and glucose censoring. Fran, would you like to come to stage? And in the meantime, I would like to thank our sponsors, Avid Freestyle Libre, for enabling us to have this conversation today. Fran, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bridget. It's good to be here.
I have a whole lot of questions for you. I know that we gathered a bunch from our community, and I'm very excited to get to dive right in. So could you kind of begin by telling us, how have you found data from sensor technology like the Freestyle Libre? How have you found it useful in helping clients with diabetes decide on their eating plans?
Oh, thank you. I think it's been amazing, and I was almost in preparation for this thinking about how did we do it before using this technology, because from 20 years ago where we were trying to get the finger prick testing and trying to figure out what suited a person and how they were responding to all the information that we're getting now, this device or technology literally is a personalization for each person. Living with diabetes, I've used it on non-diabetics, and I know the focus is obviously on our diabetics, and that's why I just think it's been phenomenal to say, well, before we make any decisions about the food that you're asking me about, what has your information told us? And I think it's just so beautiful, to not have it related to finger prick, pain and just the frustration of everything that comes from finger prick testing, but just having this seamless available information, which has really personalized things a lot.
What I would love to understand a little bit more is the actual practicalities of it. So once you look at a person's graph, then what? Like, can you read from looking at someone's graph? Can you say, okay, breakfast is working, lunch isn't working, something funny is happening on here? Or is that something that a doctor kind of has to explain for you?
When we put a patient onto the device, I say to them, eat as per normal for a few days. So we want to almost take what they're currently doing and just see if there are any obvious spikes. Obviously, we're looking at, well, what is our baseline? So baseline meaning if you're waking up in the morning, let's start there. A starting point is always the right place. Otherwise, if we're starting off on a higher level already in the morning before you eat, we actually need to go back to that. And so even in terms of me handing it back to a doctor, if they are waking on a high sugar reading, a lot of it actually doesn't need to have to do with food until we start eating. So I think it's that beauty of being in support with the patient and saying, well, we need to speak to your doctor about your evening dosage of insulin so that we wake up on a good reading. And then from there, yes, it's beautiful then to see if a person has had a spark, saying, hey, what happened here? And again, with the technology and people being able to add their information into the device or on the app, is I say to them, please add as much. I'm not bored of information. Almost more information is better than little information, because if I'm going to ask you about a Monday 3 weeks ago, we need to know why there was a spark afterwards, or why suddenly you dropped afterwards. So I don't know if that answers your question correctly, but yes, it's very obvious, and we go from there, whether it needs to go back to the doctor for fine-tuning medication-wise, or whether we need to make some sort of change to the diet.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I just want to welcome all our community members from Facebook. It looks like we had a little glitch in the beginning there, but now we are all set up. And I'm going to introduce you again, Fran. Sorry, just for those who have just joined us. My name is Bridget McNulty. I'm the co-founder of Sweet Life Diabetes Community. I've been living with type 1 for the last 16 years, so I have a lot of questions about diet and diabetes, as absolutely anyone who lives with diabetes has. And I'm joined today by our expert, Fran Stiert. She is a dietitian and she has a special focus for us today on how to use sensor technology, whether that's the Freestyle Libre or other systems, how to use it to really make sense of your blood glucose. So welcome, Fran. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Shane has asked a question here that I don't know the answer to, and I'm hoping you know the answer to. How is it possible that nutritionists have better luck with treating diabetics than dietitians do? I didn't even know the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist. I thought they were the same thing.
In terms of graduation from our nutrition versus dietetic, dietitians have a postgraduate and are allowed to treat and with illness and disease. Nutritionists, they can do a short course and a long course, and I almost see them as health coaches. So I think that's where sometimes it's less scary. I want to say, I always, when I meet patients and they've seen dietitians before, I really try and win them over, because it's so scary, number one, being diagnosed with it, and then knowing you're going to see the dietitian who's probably going to say, you need to cut out this and that. And that's where I say, we don't cut anything out until we know how it responds in your body and with your medication. So my point of view is, living with diabetes is already a tough change. Never mind us as practitioners seeing you as a robot who suddenly doesn't like ice cream or chocolate or a pizza. And again, it's about trying to say, well, how do I meet my patient where they are? How do I assist them in understanding? And if we still see well-managed glucose curves and they've been able to manage some pizza or a burger or whatever and still control their sugars, why should they not be allowed to do that? So I think it's suddenly humanizing the person. So I don't know, Shane, if this has answered your question, but it makes me very sad to hear how dietitians are possibly letting a lot of people down. And my hope is to restore that and say that each of us dietitians do have specialities in different areas. And I think suddenly when you have spent enough time with patients with diabetes, is I want to be your team, I want to be your biggest cheerleader, and I want to stand with you, not so it's wonderful that the nutritionists are helping. I hope more dietitians can help. Yeah.
That's so helpful to hear also, because I think a lot of people have had kind of top-down dietitian advice, which doesn't help any of us, right? Because then it's like, here's an eating plan, eat this, because I've told you. Goodbye, come back and let me tell you how you failed. And that's not helping anyone, right? Like that's, and I think it can be hard sometimes for dietitians to understand the mental toll that diabetes takes, because it's chronic. It's not a diet, right? So none of us can be on a diet, because if you're on a diet, you have an end goal, and our end goal is like the end goal of life. So that doesn't work. I have a bunch of questions that we're going to dive in now. But if anyone has questions they want us to ask live, please feel free to comment and I will throw those in as well. But I know a lot of you had questions that you RSVP'd to the event for. And just so that you know, we are recording this and it will be available afterwards. So hopefully you're able to join us live, but if not, you're very welcome to listen. Okay. Yolene wanted to know, I chose all the ones that I have questions for too. Yolene wanted to know how to manage sugar spikes effectively through diet.
Good question. All right. So I think with sugar spikes, number one, the beauty of technology is at least being able to see what does spike us and deal with those that spike. I think it also helps us to make decisions for the rest of the day. So sometimes once a spike happens, We might not be able to undo it, but we can definitely improve on the response thereafter. So it helps suddenly making decisions going forward. So things like, I don't know how many out there follow, but Glucose Goddess, very popularly follow, and I bring all of those simple techniques into practice. So things like going for a 10-minute walk or squatting or doing some sort of leg exercise, even if it is 10 squats, can really take a spike. And I've seen it in many of my patients where we've seen a spike happening and we ask them to do the squats then, or put on a song and dance in your lounge or your kitchen or wherever it is. And just by allowing that body to reabsorb the glucose in the system, suddenly that spike is on the downward trend, and within a few minutes you can start to see your arrow coming down. So doing a little bit of activity, because essentially your muscles are helping to mop up what's going on. Obviously, we're talking to patients on insulin and also non-insulin. So I'm obviously just trying to collaborate some of the information. And again, each person might respond differently. So it's about finding what works for you. The apple cider vinegar, or the vinegar aspect, I don't know if a lot of people have heard that. Not the nicest option. So I think, again, it's finding something like, if you don't mind eating gherkins, but basically what vinegar does is it also, even if it's done after eating, it's not too late to help to mop up what glucose is doing in the bloodstream. It actually goes and activates your muscle cells to open and to help to at least bring down the glucose a little bit afterwards. So some of my
wait. I gotta pause you there, because I didn't know that gherkins were an option. I love gherkins, and I can't be taking a spoonful. So the advice, for those who haven't heard of it, from Glucose Goddess, who is this wonderful international author, and she gives like tips to balance out your blood glucose, but based in science. She's wonderful. You should definitely follow her. But her advice is that you have a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar before you eat. Every time before you eat. And I've just ignored that one because I'm never going to do it. But I love gherkins, and I actually have a very good homemade gherkin recipe that is just rice wine vinegar, chopped cucumbers, and fresh dill, and it's delicious. So if you were to have, hypothetically, me before dinner, have like a gherkin or a couple of slices of this pickle, that would be enough to, why and how does that work?
Okay, so essentially what our vinegar, so a lot of people say, if I use limes or lemons, does it have the same effect? The acidity is not high enough compared to balsamic vinegar, apple cider vinegar. And so that's why in any form, so if you also like balsamic vinegar on your salad before, you can do that. So essentially what it does is we have enzymes that once the carbohydrates into our our stomachs, breaks down the carbohydrates. What vinegar does is essentially stunts them from breaking down the carbohydrates. So the release is a lot slower into the bloodstream. And then once the vinegar is even in your bloodstream, it also goes and activates your muscle cells to open up. So that's where it's got the mopping up effect. And that's why the science is showing us that even if you've missed doing it before a meal, even if it's your gherkin or whatever that's been pickled in vinegar, it will still have a good effect because you're getting the fiber and the vinegar combination. But even if you do it, if you're noticing your sugars are slightly higher than you would like, you can still do something about it then without having to drink the apple cider vinegar. So definitely you can.
That is a big relief to me, because the apple cider vinegar was never going to happen. So to summarize, for those who have recently joined us, we're talking about how to kind of counteract sugar spikes, how to manage sugar spikes. And Fran, our lovely dietitian, is telling us that if you notice, I'm summarizing for myself as well. So if you notice your blood glucose going in a spike, which is much easier to do, obviously possible to do with finger stick testing, but much easier to do if you have sensor technology like the Freestyle Libre or other systems. If you notice a spike happening, two of the most effective things you can do: one is apple cider vinegar or gherkins or pickles, either before you eat or even after. And the other is a dance around your room after you eat, or squats. Literally just like raise down squats, 10 squats.
So sorry, as if you're sitting on the toilet and back up again. So obviously those with bad knees, please don't say your dietitian said you had to do squats and not manage. But basically anything that you're activating your big muscle group with, which is your legs essentially. So that's why it's finding out whether it's a dance because you're using your legs, or whether it's going for a walk, or if it's doing your squats, you're activating your biggest muscle group basically. Yeah.
That is great to know. I'm gonna incorporate both of those tonight for dinner. Thank you. Marielle has said to us, exercise is imperative. Cardio definitely helps bring a spike down, and we are all in agreement there. And Annette says, I see that exercise with my clients, the glucose drops. I managed an 8-year-old type 1, and exercise is wonderful for him when he has a spike. So I feel like we've ticked that one, and I have action items, which is very exciting for me. Tasneem's question was both hilarious and sad. She said, what are snack options that won't make me feel depressed daily? I feel you, Tasneem. What have you got for us, Fran?
I know, and that was such a difficult question to receive, because again, until I'm sitting with that person and saying, what do you feel is deprivation? Because again, somebody likes something sweet, or somebody likes something savory, or somebody likes something tarty. I think it's again meeting them and saying, well, what do you feel like will help? And again, if it's a sweet treat, or if it's if it's a sweet treat, which again in the typical diabetes diet world, where it's almost seen as taboo, or a lot of people misconceive and say you're not allowed your dessert or whatever. I think again it's about saying, well, how do we combine things better? So again, instead of doing Provitas by itself, and I know Provitas are so done, so I'm so sorry, Tasneem, I don't mean to be using that, but again, I would say I want to find you where you are at, and what would that look like? So if you felt like give me an idea, I'm trying to think, but if you felt like something like a packet of chips,
chocolate, everyone feels like chocolate all the time.
Okay. All right. So chocolate, I think again, it's saying, how do we not eat it on an empty stomach? Because by itself, it's going to have the greatest impact on your sugars and your spikes. So for me, again, the most important thing with talking to anyone is not saying no to it. It's saying there's a better time for you to have it. So if you are a sweet tooth person, rather try and have it after your meal. So it would be way better on your glucose control by having it after a meal where there's been some veggies or salad or gherkins or something like that. Or if you are desperate, I know menstruation times and all of that, we've got cravings as ladies. So if it's in the afternoon and you just can't find anything else, have a few nuts before you have your piece of chocolate or two. But again, it's about saying don't do it by itself. Or if it's more a savory person, is trying to say, well, number one, what would maybe be a lower carb option that doesn't result in a too high a spike? But if there is something that you're really craving and you can't divert having it, is how do we combine it with something else a little bit better, so that you can still have that as a snack? I don't know if that helps in any way.
I think that's super helpful. And also I think there's such, like, I love your whole approach towards diet, that it's not, you can't have this. Because as soon as you tell someone that you can't have something, that's inevitably all they want, right? And it's like, don't think about a pink elephant, and then all you can think about is a pink elephant. So I love dark chocolate, and I eat it fairly often. But because I eat it fairly often, it's not a big deal. And so I can eat a small amount, and I always have it with nuts. And actually, I believe in the nut thing so much that I carry a little bag of nuts with me in my handbag. And if I'm out and there's something sweet that I want to eat, it feels like protection if I have nuts with it. Because and my understanding is that the protein anchors the carb. Is that true? Oh, love a nod. Thank you. We've got some very interesting diet questions to jump into, but I want to say Naomi has said, my sugar's been very erratic the last few months. I'm type 1, and if it's not high, it's very low. At the moment, I'm battling with readings of 10 and over first thing in the morning, and at night, I'm getting lows. Oh, I hate that, which is anything from under 4 and much lower. And then she gives her insulin. So we can't help with insulins, Naomi, but I would say that if you are high every morning and low every night, then it's probably time to speak to your doctor about medication stuff. Because also if you're noticing patterns, so my endocrinologist always said to me, if you notice a pattern 3 days in a row, 3 days or more, then it's actually a pattern and it's something to look at. It's not just eating the wrong thing. So I would say speak to your doctor. Okay, Fran, here is a question that we got in various forms from a number of people. This one is from Genova, and she says, what can be substituted for bread or rice? Being Indian, we have a lot of curries and all our dishes require bread or rice. Please do not say cauliflower rice, Fran. It's not a thing. It's disgusting. Nobody wants to eat it.
No. So again, if you haven't joined us yet, I think you'll know that I'm the dietitian that is probably going to be the person to say, well, how do we include it in your meal? And I think the beauty of South Africa is we have such diversity in our foods and our cultural foods and all of that traditional, and we want to keep that in. Again, if I love a good curry. Definitely, I agree, and I think it's wonderful having it with rice or bread. Again, maybe it's figuring out a person's sensitivity. So maybe for I've forgotten the lady's name that's asked this question, but
Genova.
In terms of obviously finding out how sensitive you are to carbs. So if you're having rice and bread, that potentially is going to spike you a little bit more than what you ideally want. So again, it's that trade-off of saying, well, I'm happy to alternate that. Every time I have my curry, once I'll have it with rice, the next time I'll have it with bread. So in terms of substituting, I personally will say, well, how about we figure out the portion that your body seems happy with? So if you're not on insulin, it's figuring out what your threshold is, because there seems to be a bit of a threshold that each person, because you've still got a bit of pancreas on board and producing some insulin, you might be able to have half a cup of rice or up to a cup of rice, depending on progression of the disease, etc. And then for others on insulin is we include it in carb counting, and we say, right, for the amount of rice you have, we will dose for it. In saying that, I do again want to reiterate that there seems to be a threshold, and so when we still include it and keep it in, we want to still look at the balance and say, well, before you have your delicious curry and rice, how can we have more sambles before that? And again, bringing in the fiber content, because anytime when we're looking at carbs, we're saying, well, how do we add fiber to it? And yes, adding protein and your curry that's got a bit of, got protein in it and cooked with some fats. We are then also saying, well, how do we add in the carrot salad or the sambles along with it? Because that will also help to counter respond what the rice or the bread is going to do.
I love this because I find diabetes so fascinating. I mean, I wouldn't choose diabetes, but I do find it so fascinating because you have to learn all these other things, right? Like, who knew that? I mean, you knew because you're a dietitian, but for the rest of us, we would never have had to learn the difference that fiber makes and that fat makes and protein and all these interactions. It's so interesting. There's this wonderful book called Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, and it's very low carb. It promotes very low carb. Like, he doesn't even eat tomatoes or any fruit, and that just makes me sad because I love fruit. And your approach actually answers one of my big questions, because I've never been able to understand how I can eat fruit and it's not catastrophic for me at all for my blood sugar. I can maintain fairly stable levels, and other people can't eat fruit at all. And then there's some things I'd have just written off. So I can't eat like grapes and watermelon and that kind of thing. But there are other foods that I've completely had to write out of life, and other people say they can eat them, and I'm like, but how does that work? And as you said, it's because each person is different. But my point is, from this book that he wrote, he says somewhere in there, speaking about portion sizes and speaking about your thresholds, that's such a nice word to use for it, because he says big injections, big mistakes, small injections, small mistakes. And his advice that I've taken very much to heart, and it works very well for me, is that as much as possible, you should try not to inject more than 7 units of insulin for a meal, because if you go over that, odds are your maths is wrong, right? Our maths is always wrong in some way because we're humans and not pancreases. And so then you're either going to go high or low. Whereas if you can keep your portion size manageable so that you can inject 7 units, or if you are type 2, so that it's within your threshold when you're not spiking, that makes things, make a big difference. Olefile has a fantastic question that I would like you to answer. What are the dangers of overeating even though you calculate your required insulin correctly? Gosh, I got nothing. Fran, what have you got?
What are the dangers of overeating even if you've calculated?
Yeah, even though you calculate your required insulin correctly.
Okay.
So why is overeating not a good idea?
Gotcha.
If you take blood sugar out of it.
Okay. So in terms of, again, maybe it's this whole threshold thing, is our cells and our bodies can manage with certain amounts. And once it gets to a threshold, this is where the whole insulin resistance comes out or comes in, is even if we have insulin naturally produced by our pancreas, or even if we are giving it through an injection, is our cells can only manage a certain amount. So we're talking about our cells where the insulin is now trying to go and unlock the cells to get that glucose in or that carbohydrate in. And so cells are also going to start to throw a little bit of a tantrum sometimes, where if we have calculated correctly, so let's say we are having 60 grams of carbs and we are giving 10, 15 units of insulin because that's our ratio and we have calculated it, our cells get to a point where they are exhausted. I like to use it as they're just fatigued and they are tired. You are knocking on that door to make them open up again to get glucose in, because that's what your body's trying to do. And so your cells stay shut, and that insulin now needs to put it somewhere else. So what does it do? It starts to store it. It starts to store it in our livers. It starts to store it in our body fat cells, in our abdominal area. It'll find a way, because our bodies are fantastic and they do these amazing things, even if we need to add insulin in. So my answer is essentially saying that overeating, even if we have calculated correctly and given the enough insulin, can still lead to other complications. So we might get our sugars maybe down or corrected again eventually, but it's asking in that situation of how has our body actually coped if we're doing it continuously. If it's a once-off and you've gone to a party and you've overeaten, it's fine. But I think it's again asking, is it happening because I'm starving or feeling hungry each meal, which also is often a sign of insulin resistance, where those cells are just actually hungry even though they're not getting the glucose into them. So the feedback to our brains is telling us that. So again, I hope that helps.
Yeah, great answer. And also, I think what's so important that can be quite difficult to remember sometimes, because we're so focused as people with diabetes on our blood glucose and our dosing and on what we're eating, it can be quite difficult to remember that the purpose of food is to enjoy it and to feel well afterwards. And I think that's a big part of overeating, right? Like, no one feels great when you've overeaten. You're like lying on the couch, rolling around. You don't feel well, you don't feel vital, you don't have energy. And so I think that also has to come into any discussion about food, is how does it make you feel afterwards? For those who have just joined us, you are so welcome. I'm Bridget McNulty from Sweet Life Diabetes Community, and I'm having the most delightful conversation with dietitian Fran Steert. She's answering all our questions. Feel free to pop your questions in the chat. I see Rion gave us a lovely compliment about how important advocacy is, not only from people with diabetes, but also from our healthcare champions. And Sheila said, good topic, good day. Thank you so much, Sheila. We agree. So I want to dive a little more deeply into insulin resistance, and specifically how you can spot it on your graph, right? So I use a Freestyle Libre, and I look at my graphs every day, and I find it fairly easy to analyze what I'm looking at. And I know that certain times of the month I'm more insulin resistant than others. And it does seem sometimes like the insulin just isn't working. So we have a question here from Janice, who said, I'm insulin resistant, so I reach a plateau when meds and weight loss no longer work. What should I be eating? So I'm very curious how you spot insulin resistance in a graph, and then what you do about it, if you got any advice for us.
So there's a few answers or scenarios. So I think the first thing is to understand insulin being a hormone and knowing that it's not working in isolation. So knowing that, especially, I don't know for you, Bridget, but that waking up in the morning, knowing when our bodies are pushing out a lot of cortisol, adrenaline, because now we're waking up. In the teenage years, there's a lot of hormones. There's hormones at certain times of the month that are producing a lot more in our bodies. And those can often also work against what our insulin is trying to do. So I think it's looking at the form in which insulin resistance we're looking at. So a lot of times we'll say that people are more insulin resistant in the mornings, for example, because they're then needing a higher dosage of insulin with breakfast, because there are these other hormones that are antagonizing or working against the insulin, for example. And then throughout the day, so in this scenario, it seems to improve. So for majority of my patients is by lunchtime, supper time, because now we've started moving around, that influx of extra hormones has settled a little bit, hopefully, unless there's stress levels, which again, I'm sure you can also agree that hormones, menstruals and stress can also just almost become make our insulin a lot more resistant to its functionality. And then when does it get, oh, are we back? Okay, is lunch and dinners or back into the afternoon. So if our kids are getting more active, at school and through the day and doing sport, by the evening they might need a lot less insulin, because now suddenly those muscles are also helping to mop up versus having to add extra insulin. In terms of, so that's from an insulin point of view, almost physiological aspect. From an insulin resistant or pre-diabetic point of view, I think if I can talk about that, reach a plateau with meds and weight loss, not working any longer. It is tricky, just because well done for doing so much. I think it's amazing. I think it is looking at exercise, because if we look at the mode of what exercise does, is it almost helps to alleviate what insulin is also trying to do. So by it opening up without the key, which is your insulin, exercise or doing some sort of physical activity helps you. And so a lot of people will engage in weight-bearing exercises, because again, it's forcing that muscle to really open up and utilize whatever is needed. So again, it's about how can we help our body. So if you have reduced carbohydrates, because again, it helps our cells feel a little bit better and wake up again. But if you have done kind of the diet and the med side, it's saying, well, is there something like doing a little bit more physical activity, which also really sensitizes those cells so that we're not needing extra insulin to make them function.
Yeah, that's great. I know insulin is sometimes called the third insulin. No, exercise is sometimes called the third insulin, because it works in much the same way. So I think that's very helpful. I just want to set Naomi's mind at ease. There are different kinds. She said that she's worried because she's never been told to calculate insulin per meal portion. There are different kinds of insulins. So there is long acting, which you take usually once a day, sometimes twice a day, that works in the background. There's rapid acting or fast acting that you take with every meal. And then there are also once a day options. So it depends what your doctor has given you. But if you're worried about your numbers, then it's always a good idea to speak to your healthcare professional. And if having a sensor is an option for you, it can also really reveal a lot of things, because instead of seeing 4 or 5 points throughout the day, as you do with finger sticks, you get to see a 24-hour graph, which is very life-changing sometimes. I remember the first time I wore a sensor and I thought it was fine if I ate scones, because I ate them with cheese, and cheese is protein. And 2 hours after I'd eaten scones, my blood sugar was back to normal, so I didn't think it was a problem. And then I wore a sensor and my blood sugar went all the way up and then came down 2 hours later. And I was very sad that scones were no longer an easy thing to eat. Jonathan has asked us here, I think my original question, he would like to find out what the best tool is to use to treat lows. I like to use snacks that have a known effect on my glucose, a calculated effect. So I use Super C's, which are about 2.5 grams of carb per sweet. I can see if I need 2 or 3 sweets to stabilize and between 4 to 5 to have a rise in blood glucose. Are there other over-the-counter or off-the-shelf treats like dextrose that will have a similar effect? Looks like a very long question, but just so that everyone can have a look at what Jonathan's asking. I'll give my very quick opinion. I use Super Cs or Glucose Cs, which are like the disclaimer option that are easier to chew. And at night, my best tip ever for anyone with type 1 or any child with type 1, because I don't know how it took me like 12 years to figure this out, is to have a juice box next to my bed at night, so that if I wake up low at night, then I can just reach for the juice box. I don't have to get up and walk through to the kitchen and make decisions. But Fran, what do you recommend for low blood glucose?
Yeah, great question. And I know that the community we're chatting to, it can be very scary, and I don't want to take away from that. And I think if anything, it is about saying, how do we keep it in a portion that doesn't mean we overdo it? Because I think in that state of panic and being very nervous, it's just getting it in, especially the first few times when it's so new, or when it's obviously on a 1 or a 2, it's very scary. So I think, again, I love the juice box. I often recommend that just because it also keeps well, whether it's in your bag, whether it's in the car. Obviously it might get a bit hot, but it's in a certain portion. And our recommendation, and again, without getting too clinical, is saying in that moment is, how do we have the equivalent of about 15 grams of carbs, just to kind of peak it, and then retesting after 10 to 15 minutes, which I know feels like ages waiting, but I think it's again about not over responding. So giving it 10 to 15 minutes, rechecking, seeing if it's now above and in a range that you feel happy with, and then going into a snack. And I love using like milk or a Milo, again, because it's got carbs, proteins, and fats in it. So it can often, if the low isn't too severe, so if I see a downward trend, and I've had a few little kids in my office where they're on the downward trend, I'll give them a glass of milk, just because they're on their way down quite quickly, and a liquid is going to obviously be absorbed. And that's why Super Cs also work so well, because they are dissolvable in the mouth versus chocolate that's got quite a high fat content, and it takes quite a while to get into the system. But in terms of you wanting that quick fix just to pick you up and then keep you there, and so if it's still dropping after 10 to 15 minutes, is to do it again. And whether it's now still another juice box, I don't know if you've had to do that before, or if it's then popping the Super Cs in. But yeah, I think it's again finding that portion of 15 grams of carbs, having 1 to 3 options, and then also knowing that milk can work very well if it's not too low. So I'm not saying do it when it's on a 2 or whatever. It's more when you see it on the downward trend and it's quite close to 4, something like a milk with some Milo in it can kind of pick it up again and keep it steady, as opposed to suddenly shooting up to the 20s, and then we're trying to fix the highs after a low. Yeah.
I think that's actually one of the hardest things about diabetes, and so hard to explain. I mean, you can obviously see it because you've seen so many people coming in and having the same thing, and you're looking at the graphs, but it's so hard to explain. Like I've said to friends before, where they're like, oh, it must be great if you then get to eat whatever you want, or you can like dive into the treat jar. And I'm like, no, when I was first diagnosed, I used bar ones as low treatment because I love bar ones, and I was very sad that I could never eat them anymore. And you must know how terrible that was, because it's like fast acting and slower acting because of the chocolate. I put on so much weight. I was just eating bar ones. It was terrible. So I'm with Jono with the Super Cs and Glucose Cs juice boxes. The other thing I found helpful, and again, this only really works when you have a graph, because as you say, if you're in like the 4s and going down slowly, not going straight down, going down slowly, you want something, but you don't want something that's going to mess you up. And so sweets then don't work, right? Because then you spike up. I found a small apple works really well too, and is surprisingly fast. Like I knew bananas were fast, and I didn't think apples were as much, but I found apples helpful. I didn't know about the milk trick. I found flavored yogurt is also helpful if I'm on a downward trend, because it's got the protein that kind of stabilizes it a little bit. And I'll do that if I'm on a downward trend at night, because it's quite nice before bed. We're going to dive into we have so many questions still. Don't worry, I can calm down. We still have 20 minutes. Shay has asked, if you'd like to use the Libra but can't afford it, what can I do? Terrific question, Shay. What we're trying to do, there is actually a lot of advocacy going on in the background around CGM. So if you are part of a medical aid, you can look on fingerstickfree.org. I'm going to put the website in there now, and it will tell you which medical aid, what you have to do for each medical aid. You often have to submit a motivation letter, and they might want past HbA1c results and that kind of thing. And if you need support in that, SA Diabetes Advocacy can help you. I'm going to put all the details in the chat. And if you aren't on medical aid, we are currently working on trying to get the beginning research done in public clinics. That's specifically for kids and pregnant women is where it would make sense to start. They are expensive, unfortunately. And we're working on that too, right? We're doing everything we can. There are a lot of moving parts, and I think we're going to see a big change in the next year. It feels like there's a lot that's all coming together. But I hear you. It needs to be available to as many people as possible, as soon as possible. I'm going to throw you an easy question now, Fran, because I feel like I've been throwing you difficult ones. Corneille wants to know the carb ratio for cappuccino, which I think is actually a very common question, and I have no idea what the answer is.
So good question. For those of you who haven't used it or haven't tried it out, Fat Secret is an app that is really great. It has a lot of South African-based foods and drinks on it. And so even this morning, knowing that this question was coming up, because quite often if we know it's about a glass of milk, if it's a cappuccino, it's about 12 grams of carbs, but it does obviously depend. So if you're a skinny cappuccino person and you go to the coffee shop and ask for a skinny cappuccino, then obviously it's going to be a lot less. So that's where the app comes in quite nicely in terms of really fine-tuning your carb counting if you are carb counting or working it out. And then sachets. So those delicious Nestle sachets are also about 15 grams of carbohydrates. So I think, again, if you haven't looked on Fat Secret, pop on with what you enjoy in the search box. You can even be quite specific and try to find the closest thing to what you have. So if it's a skinny cappuccino or if it's a full cream milk cappuccino and it gives you quantities of milk, it will really give you a good relationship or a good ratio that you can work on for carbohydrate wise. Yeah.
And then why is it that sometimes black coffee also makes your blood glucose spike? What's going on there?
I know this is a bit of another conversation, but genetics. So I do genetic testing in my practice, and it's been so interesting because some of us are more sensitive to caffeine than other people. And so with my patients who are wearing the Libra and even non-diabetic patients, we see a spike even if it's a black coffee. And we can almost link it that the caffeine is a stimulant, and what it's doing in terms of the body's response is suddenly having this heightened glucose is what I'm putting into kind of observation wise, and also seeing that seems to be the link. Yeah. So caffeine being the stimulant, and whether some people are more sensitive to it than others.
And that makes sense because we know some people are more sensitive to it than others, right? My husband can have a cup of coffee, real caffeine coffee, and then go straight to sleep. And I'm in awe. Elri has a question. I was told to have a snack, but only a protein and only a fruit and not both at once. However, then a food coach told me to have both at once. What is the correct way?
I don't know why you were told not to have the protein and the fruit to have that. I would definitely do that combination. I think it's a great combination, again, because your carbs aren't sitting naked. You're not having your fruit by itself, and you're adding something to it like a protein, which again helps to offset what the carb or the fruit is going to do afterwards. So I think that's go with the combination. And if you're getting good responses, why not? It's only if we're really seeing terrible spikes. And I just wanted to, I know we've got time, but time and range. So like you were saying, is where people are testing before and then 2 hours afterwards with technology, how it's been able to give us the in-between information has been really informative, because suddenly you can see why people's moods change, how we feel terrible. So yes, your sugars can look good pre and 2 hours afterwards, but you felt rotten in between, and that's because you've gone to a 12 and then come back down to a 4, because now either your insulin is having to do it or your body is doing it for you. But that's where the time and range is so helpful. And I know that lady was saying earlier about if you can't afford a Libra or a sensor, what do we do? I would say if you can save up at all, at this stage while we're still advocating for these sensors for as many people as we can, save up for it. And even if you're able to do it for 2 weeks of a year, it gives you so much insight in that time that it's worth saving up or asking people for birthday present or whatever it is just the insight into it that can help to just give you the next bit of information for the next few months or whatever you need, and can be helpful. Yeah.
And it does make such a difference also because, as you were saying, we're all so different. So it's not like you can just follow an eating plan and then you're done with it. Like what affects me doesn't affect the next person with diabetes, and even what affects me today doesn't affect me tomorrow, which drives me mad, to be honest. Like that's the bit about diabetes that really annoys me, because I've got to the point now where I've got the same thing for breakfast, the same thing for lunch, and I'm taking the same amount of insulin and exercising at the same time of day, and it still isn't the same every day. And I'm like, come on, like throw me a bone here. We have so many comments and questions flooding in. Thank you so much. Rian, we are going to talk about weight loss. That's coming up. Jessie says a piece of apple with peanut butter. Her type 1 daughter loves it. And Cecile is saying powdered dextrose or glucose powder. But since the beginning of the year, she hasn't been able to find them anywhere. Powdered dextrose or glucose powder. What's up with that? Do you have any idea, Fran? Yeah.
In terms of the promoting it or finding it, I don't know. No.
I know I've seen that before at Dischem, but I haven't looked lately. Okay, Shay had a question that I would love an answer to, please. Where to get cheap, sustainable, and quick diabetic-friendly foods that won't raise my sugars? So we got a lot in there. We've got cheap, sustainable, and quick, and diabetic-friendly. So this is the hard question. This is why I gave you the cappuccino question earlier.
About me is what I want to say. No, good question. I think my initial response is I steer away from anything that is going to say diabetic friendly. The reason being is I find that a lot of things, it's easy to jump on the bandwagon from a marketing perspective and make it sound really amazing, whereas actually it's often way more costly and it's not necessarily better. So anything, for example, like the light, anything light, for example, be careful of what light means, because it might mean light in sugar, but there's still carbohydrates in it. So I think it can be very deceiving in terms of diabetic friendly foods. I would again rather find or use your money on foods that are still readily available, where we can find a good balance. Like if you enjoy an apple and peanut butter, why not? Versus now buying a special bar that's diabetic friendly, for example. In terms of where to get cheap, sustainable, again, it's so hard to answer that because it's quite relative in terms of what is cheap. In terms of what is available. So something like if you can't afford almonds and cashew nuts, peanuts can still be okay. So I think again it's about saying, well, what do you like veg sticks or don't you like veg sticks? Do you enjoy, if blueberries are too expensive or berries are expensive, how do we give you a normal fruit, but can you eat it with some peanuts before that then? So again, not necessarily having to go for diabetic friendly options. There are some lovely, and I'm sure somebody like you could respond to that maybe more so from me, just because I try and stay away from just giving information out that go and buy these, because I'm trying to find other household items to use, essentially.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Sweet Life's approach is whole foods as close to nature as possible. That's how I eat. So that's how we recommend people eat. But while we are talking about fancy bandwagons to jump on, Lynn wanted to know, are keto, paleo, or Atkins best for either type 1 and type 2, or only one condition? Maybe you can give us a quick rundown of what the difference is, because I'm not entirely sure I know the difference. So over to you.
No problems. So Atkins can probably be likened very similarly to Banting, where the fat is more from animal protein, so butters, creams, meat fat, that sort of thing, but very low carbohydrate. From keto, it's still low carbohydrate, but the fat is higher, but it's from your your plant-based. So it's more oils, olives, avos, nuts, seeds. So the fat content in both of those is very different. They're both very low carb diets, however. And then paleo is very whole foods, sweet potato, that sort of thing. So yeah, more whole food based. In terms of type 1s and type 2s, again, I've just found that people are so different. So almost where it's worked for somebody, and I'm sure each of us can say that we've seen that in many of these diets when people are trying it out, is some people will swear by it and what it does, versus others that it does nothing for them. Again, what I'm finding is our genetics have a very huge predisposition to what works for us and what doesn't. And we're hoping that that also becomes more available, because it's just another puzzle piece that gives us insight into how our bodies respond, how it's sensitive to certain foods and not to others, for example. But maybe my answer to that would be, I am super aware. I'm happy to help people if they're wanting to embark in keto or whatever they are coming to meet me with. I would rather them ask me than Dr. Google, and me help guide and figure it out. My question would be is, why are we doing it, and what other conditions might you have? So if there's something like fatty liver disease, or if there is cardiovascular disease, we need to take that into account, because we're not just then looking at diabetes and what it does. And again, a lot of people that have been on super low carb meal plans, their sugars are still high. So my answer or question then is, why eliminate such a big food group when actually we can still get the same sort of thing and it feels sustainable? So that leaves me with my other thing, is how sustainable is that afterwards? So yes, a lot of people have done it for a very strict certain amount of time, but then kind of life happens or we fall off the bandwagon. And it's okay if, I almost want to say foundationally, if somebody has chosen to go lower carb, I think it's about looking at the bigger picture and saying, right, what does lower carb look like? Or if I'm coming from my baseline being quite high to reducing it, and it's helping me feel better. So again, a lot of these diets for some people might help with weight loss, but then they feel terrible. So it's finding a unique way of saying, well, maybe there's an incorporation, maybe it's a modified Mediterranean diet that works well for you. So whole foods, or there's aspects of paleo that you want to do. So I think it does make it more complicated, but it's also saying, like, what do you hope to achieve from following this, and how do we make it that it's potentially sustainable afterwards? Yeah.
To me, sustainable is the most important thing, right? Because we're not talking, like I said earlier, we're not talking about a diet. We're talking about an eating plan for the rest of your life. And that's also the beauty of where the sensor technology comes in, because if you can concentrate on how you feel, concentrate on how the food makes you feel. So like, is it delicious to eat? Are you excited about your meals? And then concentrate on how you feel afterwards, and then be able to compare that with your blood glucose results. Then I feel like you can find this magical middle ground where you are almost able to make up the right kind of diet that specifically works for you. And to me, the whole beauty of the Banting movement was that it made us look at carbs. And I remember when it first came out, I was eating for breakfast, I was eating yogurt with raw oats and fruit. And that was like a triple carb header without any real protein. And I was like, oh, maybe this is too much. And I never would have thought of that. And a lot of people, I think, it cut out a lot of the fast food that they ate. And so there are many aspects of it that I think are really helpful. And lower carb is definitely the way to go. And none of us should be eating refined carbs. We all know this. We only have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to encourage you to ask any last minute questions, but I want to ask Rian's question about weight loss. What do we do about weight loss if motivation to exercise is tricky? Particularly, a lot of people with diabetes have sore feet. Can you lose weight just by changing your diet? Should we be talking about medications? What is your advice if people come to you for weight loss?
Yeah, also again, and if anybody that sees it, weight loss is a journey, same as diabetes. Weight loss is a journey. I think you need to find whether, again, somebody mentioned nutrition coach earlier, whatever it is, it's finding somebody that can walk that journey with you. It is finding, so if the motivation is not there for exercise, I think if there's also something that I've realized is exercise, I would rather have people use to make them feel better rather than think that it's a way of weight loss, because again, it does so much for us psychologically, whereas if suddenly it's used as a weight loss tool, again, it feels like a diet. So I think for me, do exercise, do dancing in the kitchen, because it uplifts you and it makes you feel amazing. Number two is, yes, I would say eating and what we're eating can play a major role. And here again, my thoughts and the way I'm almost doing practice now is so different. I hate handing out a meal plan because, again, that association with if I don't follow it, I'm failing is huge for a person. And for me, it's saying, well, how do we rather make, I don't know, like that book, Atomic Habits. It's about saying, how do we make one small change this week that in a month's time I don't notice anymore because I've already started it now and it's become part of my lifestyle. So Rian, for me, I would say, again, jot down for yourself what you are eating. Start with breakfast and start to make macro changes where you might feel like it could improve, because as soon as you start somewhere, it gives you not that overwhelming feeling that you now have to fix the whole day. Start with one place and then slowly go on from there. I don't know if that helps.
I was going to ask you what the one atomic habit you would suggest is, and then you answered before I even asked. Shay has what is probably our last question for the day. What is your opinion on water intake? I drink a lot of water just to stabilize sugars. I'm a type 1 and I've been told the amount of water I drink is unhealthy. Could you advise me on that?
Yeah, so definitely one of the first things, like you were saying earlier, is there's so many different reasons why sugars are raised. And one of the first, if your food hasn't changed, we ask about hydration, because our temperatures in South Africa can get really ridiculous and we can sweat it out. And suddenly we've got glucose that is higher in our bloodstream. So it's great that you are so into water. I think it's asking, has it affected your electrolytes in any way? So is it depleting you a little bit more? So where it's meant to be something beneficial, is it now making you not feel beneficial? So who is basically saying that it's maybe too much for you, that you may be overdoing it, or if it's bypassing things like hunger, or if it's affecting your electrolytes. And those are things that can be tested on like a blood test. So I think, again, it's about saying some people are just naturally more thirsty than others. And so listen to your body. Again, if you're pushing yourself to finish something because you feel like it's good for you and you need to have more of it, maybe that's the reassessment of what is my thought process about water. Or if I'm just very thirsty, it's great to drink. So keep doing it.
I just want to say what an absolute joy to have spent this time with you. Thank you so much, Fran. I am so grateful that you spent this time, and also that you have such a unique and kind approach to diet and people with diabetes. I want to thank everyone here for joining us today. We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for your excellent questions, both beforehand and live today. We actually have another one of these events tomorrow at 7. So if you have more questions, please join us again tomorrow at 7. And big thanks to Avid Freestyle Libra for suggesting this and sponsoring this for us. And if you have other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will be able to respond. This is also going to be live on our Facebook page on South Africans with Diabetes. And I want to say an enormous thank you, Fran, for sharing all your wisdom with us. You are just wonderful.
For having me. It's been a joy, and I really hope that we can help more of you out there.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.